Welcome to Excel magic trick number 1347. Hey, if you want to download this Excel workbook, Excel magic trick 1347 finished file or the start file so you can follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, we got a great video here following up on our last video. We want to see how to split a master table into subtables with each product records on a new sheet. Now, in Excel Magic Trick 1346, we did it with an array formula. And in this video, we want to see how to do it with Power Query. Now, here's our master table. And we have records for transactions. We want to extract all the records for Yanaki onto an individual sheet. All the records for Sunshine on an individual sheet. Not only that, but as we accumulate our tables, we also want to calculate total revenue. So I need to take units times price times 1 minus the discount. Now, I'm going to show you the end result here, and then we'll go see how to do this in Power Query. Look at that. F of x. That means this is a function in Power Query that we can use over and over. Now, Power Query Custom Function is what this is called, but you can also think of it as Power Query code with an input variable. When I double-click this, it's going to ask me which records do I want to extract. You can also think of it as Power Query with input criteria or as a parameterized custom function. Really, us over in Excel, we think of it as criteria or input variable. In Power Query, you might think of it as parameterized. But guess what? These are all synonyms. All right, let's see how this works. I'm going to double-click this, and it's going to be polite. It's going to ask me, what product do you want? Not only that, but it reminds us that it must be text. I'm going to type quad and enter. And look at that. Instantly, it got all of the records for quad, and it calculated total revenue. And then we would close and load, and we'll do that later in this video. I'm going to close this and discard, and we're going to go over to the start file. All right, here we are. We're in the start file. Here's our master table. And as we scroll down, you can see there's about 187 records in all. Not only that, but we want the ability for all of our subtables to update when we add new records. Now, in order to use Power Query, you have to have your proper data set in an Excel table. I've already converted this to an Excel table and named it. Over here, it's called F Sales. Now, I click in a single cell, and in Excel 2016, you go to Data, and Power Query is Get and Transform Group. Excel 2013 to 10, you have to download and install Power Query as an extra tab. All right, in any version, how do we get data from an Excel table into Power Query? We use the From Table button. Here's our Excel table dumped into the Query Editor. First thing I want to do is come over and give this a name. I'm going to call this something smart like Get Product Records and Enter. Now, actually, I'm not going to call this a function yet because I want to actually do all the steps. Add data types, filter, add an extra column, then dump it into the sheet and test it. Then later we'll come back, duplicate the query, and convert it to a function. All right, the first thing is I see that the source and then change type. It looked like it got it correct from the icon. Decimal, decimal, text, whole number for units. That's perfect, text, text. But here, it doesn't look like it got it right. So I'm going to, instead of coming up to Home, Data Type, Dropdown, I'm going to click this little icon, and instantly a dropdown for Data Type appears. And I want to select Date. Now, before we add our extra column for revenue, I actually want to filter the data set. Let's click the drop-down. Anytime you use filter, regardless if it's over in Excel or Power Pivot or Power Query, it gives us a unique list. Now, I'm going to uncheck all and click Aspen. If I do it this way, it actually hard codes the criteria Aspen into our query. That's fine for now. But later, we'll go and change the hard-coded Aspen to a variable that we have control over. All right, I'm going to click OK. So this query filtered the data set just on Aspen. Now, our last step is to add an extra helper column here. We go to Add Column, Add Custom Column. I want to call this column Net Revenue. Now, we build our custom formula right here that will calculate on each row. I can use any of the fields over here in my calculation. Now, I really want to take units times price times 1 minus the discount, but I'd like to round. So if I were over in Excel, I would use the round function. But that function does not exist over here in Power Query. So no problem. I go to Google, I search round function Power Query, and what does it tell me? It tells me the function is Number.Round. Now, Power Query functions are case sensitive, so you better get the capitals right, the dot, and the spelling. Now, Number.Round will round differently than the round function over in Excel. Round function over in Excel does normal rounding like we learned in school. Number.Round does bankers rounding or halfway even rounding, like most databases, Access database, like VBA round function. Now, if you're wondering how that works and how it's different, search my channel. I have a video just on this Power Query Number.Round function. All right, but now we can make our calculation. I come over and double-click field units. I can see it gets inserted with square brackets. Then I do times, double-click price. There it is. Times. And I don't want to click discount because that would give me the amount of the discount. So what do I want? Open parentheses 1 minus the discount rate. So there we go. Close parentheses. That'll be our calculation, but I need to type a comma for Number.Round, and then type a 2 to tell it round to the penny. Close parentheses. And that formula will work. When I click OK, boom, there it is. Now, very importantly, look at our steps. We have the source. We changed the data type, filtered the rows, and then added a column. Now, these are called the applied steps. We want to go look at each one of the applied steps and see how Power Query actually wrote the M code. We can go to View and go to Advanced Editor. Now, we're going to look at this code here, and then later we'll come back and convert this to a function. Now, M code or Power Query code will always start with a let unless we have a custom function, which we'll see later. The first step is source, and there's our Excel.currentWorkbook function, which brings in the Excel table into Power Query. And notice this, source, change type, filter rows, and added custom. If I drag this off to the side, all of those names are actually the names of our applied steps. Now, notice something. Source, and then notice change type. Source does not have double quotes, and it doesn't have a pound sign. Anytime one of the applied steps has a space, it has to put double quotes around it. But if we had just double quotes, it would be just like normal text you can see over here in the code. So there's always a pound sign to differentiate this applied steps name from normal text. But there it is, change type. It used the Table.transform column types. And look at that. The first argument in this function is source, which of course is the name of the previous step. That previous step is always the output at that current step. So if this step is going to transform it further, it needs to know, hey, take that step. And then we have a list, field name, data type, all the way for all the columns. Our next step, Table.selectRows, and there it is. It listed change type, which is the output from the previous step. That word each means check on each row for the product equal to Aspen. Now, Aspen is hard-coded in here. We will come back and change that later to an actual variable that we're allowed to change. The final step, Table.addColumn. It lists the previous step output. The name is net revenue. And there's the word each again. You can think of this kind of like Power Pivot row context, because it'll make this calculation, Number.Round, for each row in the output filtered rows. And there's our formula. All right, I'm going to click Done. this is done. I want to close and load and test to see if it works. Home. And I'm just going to click the close and load because I want to dump it on a new sheet. And sure enough, there's all the Aspen records, and there's our calculated helper column. Now, that sheet right there I'm going to delete, but I want you to notice something over here in the Workbook Queries window pane. It says 36 rows loaded. When I delete this sheet, right-click Delete. I'm going to click Delete. And now look at that. It's listed as connection only. Now, I want to convert this to a custom function. Right-click, duplicate. And instantly, it has a duplicate. We can see this right here in our workbook query. A duplicate of that query. Now, I want to change the name of this. And I'm going to call it fx. So this will be our function that we're going to use over and over. This requires, though, that we go up to View, Advanced Editor. And remember, our goal is to make this a variable or a parameter or a formula input like we would think over in Excel. I'm going to come right before let and hit Enter, Enter, up arrow, and here's how we convert it to a function. Open parentheses, and then we get to name our variable. And I'm going to call it product name, space, and then I'm going to say as, space, and I'm going to put the data type, which is text. Close parentheses. Now, we need to tell the code down here, hey, take that name, equal sign, greater than symbol, but really it's an arrow that says, please use that name down here. Now, I'm going to come up, double-click, Control-C. The arrow says, oh, yeah, you got to come down here. Very carefully, click before the double quotes, Shift, arrow, 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 Control-V, backspace. And now look at that. Because it's up here in parentheses, this code, when it is run, will be considered a parameterized function. We will be asked to input the product name, which then will be used down here for this filter. Now I'm going to click Done. And look at that. The steps are all gone. It's just one f of x. And look at that. Enter parameter. I could put the name and invoke it and test it. But no, I'm not going to do that. I already tested it. Now we're going to load this. And if you go to Home and try to do something besides just the default option, it's not going to let you because you can only load this as a connection. So I simply click Close and Load. And now look at this over in the Workbook Queries. I'm going to try and pull this over here. Point to the bottom. Look at that. There it is. Now let's try this. I'm going to double click. And it is polite. It says, hey, please give me the product name. I'm going to type Aspen and Enter. Look at that. There's the filter. There's the column. I'm always going to do two things. I'm going to rename it, and then I'm going to load it. Click inside the name, Control-A to highlight everything. And I'm going to type Aspen Records. Now I'm going to come up and just click Close and Load because I want this to go to a new sheet, which is the default. Instantly, there's our Aspen Records. Come down to the sheet, double-click, and call this Aspen and Enter. Now I'm going to double-click this function again. Immediately type Carlota and Enter. Come over to the name, Control-A. I type Carlota Records, close and load. There are our records. Double-click, call this Carlota, and Enter. Double-click the function, type Quad, Enter. Rename it, Control-A, Quad Records, and Enter. Close and load. Double-click the sheet, Quad, and Enter. I can see my queries accumulating over here in the Workbook Queries window. Double-click the function, type Sunshine, Enter. Sunshine Records, and Enter. Close and load. Sunshine, Enter. One more, double-click the function, Yanaki, Enter. Yanaki Records, close and load. Yanaki, and Enter. Now, on each sheet, we have our subtable. Now, let's go test this. I'm going to come back to the master table, and off to the side, we have some new records. I'm going to highlight, Control-C, and then right below the data set, I'm going to Control-V. As soon as I do that, The Excel table feature will know these are new records and incorporate them into our table. Control V, Control down arrow. It got all the new records. Now, different than our last video with array formulas, when I go over to Aspen, there are still only 36 records, which is exactly how many there were before we added new records. Similarly, the Carlota sheet did not update. So what do? Well, luckily, we don't have to refresh each individual table. I simply come up to Data, and there it is, Refresh All. Or we can use the keyboard, Control-Alt-F5. And instantly over in our workbook query window, you could see it has a different total for each. Down here in our Aspen, you could see it's added 3 records. Over in our Carlota, it added a bunch of new records. All right, back to the master sheet. So what do we do here? We created this custom function that had an input variable for us. We invoked it 5 times and created our subtables. Now, I want to go look at the code for each one of these queries. Right-click, Edit. And we'll see that it's just a single line of code. You can see it right here. If we go up to View, Advanced Editor, there it is. It just invokes the function, including what we typed in. What does that mean? That means if it's invoking the function, click Done, click Close. It means if I go and edit this function, if I update all of these, we'll use the updated function. Now let's go look at one of these tables, the Carlota table. You know what? I don't really need units, discount, or price. I only need net revenue. Now, really, I should have thought this out in advance and just incorporate that into the function when I created it. But the point is, we can go back and edit this. Now, it means we're going to have to mess with the M code instead of adding extra steps. But that's what we're going to do. Right-click, Edit. There's our name right there. We go up to View, Advanced Editor. Now, if we're going to mess around with this and add some lines, we have to be aware that there's a comma at the end of each line, except for the last line. Now, notice after the last line, it says in, and then it lists the name of the last step, which is the output that should be dumped, in our case, to the sheet. All right, I want to add an extra step. I'm going to come to the end of the last step, type a comma, and then Enter. I'll come and change this last step here after we create our new line. Tab key. I'm going to give this step a name without any spaces. Remove columns, units, discount, price, space, equal sign, space. Now, if you don't know what the function name is, we'd probably want to go to Google and type Power Query Function Remove Columns. And when we do that search, we'll find out that it's Table.RemoveColumns. And the cool thing about Power Query is that they named their functions pretty smartly. Now, I'm pretty sure they didn't name it that way. I mistyped. I'll fix that so it says Table.RemoveColumns. Now, anytime you use a function, you actually have to refer to the previous step's output. So I'm going to very carefully try and highlight, pound, double quotes in the text, Control-C, and then place it in the first argument of Table.RemoveColumns. Now, if you look at help, it says put a table there, but that really was the output from the previous step, comma. And all we have to do here is put the names of our column. Now, when you have a list of items in Power Query, you have to use curly brackets. Now, if you know Excel, curly brackets are reserved for arrays. But over here, we call them lists. And we have to put in the names of our columns, double quotes, units, and double quote, and then a comma to get to the next column, discount, and double quote, comma, double quote, price. Now, hopefully, I spelled them right. And curly bracket, close parentheses. Now, the last line does not have a comma. That lets Power Query know that when we repeat, and I'm going to copy this step name, when we repeat this down here, that will be our output. So we've edited the code. Now, again, I should have thought about that originally and just incorporated it when I used the user interface to create this. But there we go. We're totally allowed to do this. I'm going to click Done. And of course, when I go to Home and Load, it just loads it as a connection. Now watch this. Here's all of the tables. I'm going to use the keyboard Control-Alt-F5. And you can see they're all updating. And sure enough, that is amazing. That function right there got rerun 5 times. We can see on the Carlota sheet, those columns are removed. Aspen, those columns are removed. Wow, that is amazing. So back on our master table sheet, in this video, we saw how to go from our master table into our subtables, one on each sheet. We saw how to create a custom function and then invoke it a bunch of times, refresh when the data changes, and also edit our function. All right, that was a lot of fun with Power Query. We'll see you next video.